I'm John Cotton, I'm the Chair of Labour Housing Group, and I'll be chairing this evening's session. We're really grateful to Thangam for joining us this evening to discuss the really crucial issue of COVID-19 and what it means for housing policy, not just now, but as we also head towards the very challenging post-pandemic world. We've got 1 hour for this session, so I'm going to start by asking Thangam to give us a 5-minute overview of the situation as she sees it, and then we'll go to questions. Can I thank everybody who's already sent in questions? I know we've shared some of these with Thangam just to give her a sense of some of the things that we want to address this evening. After Thangam's spoken, I'll be putting these questions to her. Doubtless our discussions will prompt some further questions, so can I ask that you please put those in the chat facility if you have a question that arises from what's being discussed, and I'll endeavour to bring in as many of those as I can, time permitting. So without this becoming a housing version of Just a Minute, if you can keep them fairly succinct and to the point, and resist the temptation to use the chat for general comments. Video off now. But with no further ado, I'll hand over to Thangam. Welcome, Thangam.
Hi, thank you. Great. Sorry, it's very nice not to be the one in charge, but it does also mean that I then have to say, please unmute me. And it's lovely to see you all. And it is a strange time, and I think it's been hard for everybody. But I was on a Zoom call quite late last night where somebody in the arts sector said that COVID it's like a doorway, it's like a portal that we've all had to go through. And when we get through that portal, we won't be the same. We aren't the same already. We're not the same as a country or as a party or as individuals. And we've all had struggles of varying degrees of painfulness and hardship. But none of us are going to be the same afterwards. And some of what we will take through that portal with us will be a reawakening of our Labour values, I think. And that reawakening is that if we were to design a way to go into a pandemic, it wouldn't be this. We wouldn't go into a pandemic after 10 years of Tory austerity, cuts to essential services, cuts to local government, cuts to drug and alcohol and mental health services, and a terrible austerity regime on benefits. We wouldn't go into this crisis with a largely under-regulated private rental sector, which sorry, I'm just going to try and get rid of the chat because I keep seeing it pop up, with a largely under-regulated private rental sector, and one in which prices have become more and more unaffordable, and in which the very word affordable has been treated very, very badly, in my view, by successive Tory governments. We wouldn't go into this crisis with such a chronic lack of attention to public services generally. So we wouldn't start from here. We also wouldn't start from a place in which evictions are still incredibly easy once the evictions ban has been lifted for private rental landlords to take out. We also wouldn't go into this with, I think, an enormous amount of disrespect that's been shown for the public sector and for local government and for housing and homelessness charities by the current government, who are now busy playing catch up and not doing it terribly well, in my view. So I just wanted to start it from where we wouldn't start from. But what it's taught us as we go through that portal is our Labour values matter now more than ever, because those that we clap on a Thursday evening are often those who are paying the most for poor quality housing in the private rented sector. They are often people who've had to really struggle with no access to outdoor space. They are often those people who have waited for many years on a housing list for housing that local councils are really struggling to build because of the declining capital resources that they've got. They are often those very people who most need the high quality housing that I think everyone should be entitled to have. So I just wanted to start with where we wouldn't have started from, but where we need to go from here. At the beginning of the lockdown, before the lockdown, actually, Labour MPs were calling for a lockdown. The government resisted. The beginning of the lockdown, Labour MPs, my predecessor John Healey, called for a ban on evictions and the ability for private sector tenants to defer rent and have good repayment terms. And the government didn't take any notice of the second part, but did at least take notice of the first part. And we have a 3-month ban on evictions, but not the 6-month ban that we wanted. My predecessor, John Healey, drafted with lawyer colleagues 2 excellent pieces of legislation, which I strengthened and added to the announcements from Jonathan Reynolds about what we want to do to improve universal credit if we were in government. And we put to the government, who unfortunately are in charge, that they should prevent evictions by making sure that people had a decent amount of money, increasing local housing allowance, making various reforms to universal credit, all of which are perfectly doable and sensible, and that if there were people in arrears, there should not be the provision to make people homeless, which under Section 8 of the housing legislation, of course, as you know, that 2 months arrears results in a mandatory eviction under current legislation unless we suspend that. We asked the government to suspend it so that that couldn't happen. We asked the government to bring forward their own commitment to get rid of Section 21 evictions, the no-fault evictions, and they've chosen to ignore all that. They have taken notice of our call on them to come up with a decent plan for what to do for people who were rough sleeping. But unfortunately, it appears to me, have put a lot of responsibility on local authorities without adequate funding to follow through. So we want people to be able to keep their homes, but we also want people to come out of this crisis and into decent homes. We want to reform the entire broken housing market. And as you know, that's pretty difficult when you're not in government, and you've got a government that has prioritised estate agents coming into my house over my mum being able to visit me, and has ignored the fact that local housing associations and local authorities are in a much better place to be able to stimulate the local housing market, put people back to work and give people decent homes if they've got the capital resources and the revenue support to do so. They've ignored that. So we're dealing with a government that clearly is going back to its ideological old ways. I think any possible illusion that we might have had that they'd suddenly discovered social democracy has, I think, been shattered. If any of you had that illusion, I think I had it for about 20 minutes. I thought, my goodness, they're social democrats. What happened? Doesn't seem like they really are. So that's where we are now. And my job at the moment, I think, is to continue to hold the government to account, to challenge them every step of the way, which I think so far I've issued a comment or a press release or done an article or something, parliamentary question about every single announcement they've made since I became Shadow Housing Secretary, and to work really closely with all of you, with Labour campaigners across the country, so that we're campaigning for everybody to have decent housing that's truly affordable on a tenure that's secure, powered by renewable energy, and mitigating against, not contributing to, our carbon emissions. And we need to campaign hard on this because we need it more than ever. And that's where I wanted us to start the discussion, because I know you've got lots of questions, but I hope that gives you a flavour of where we're going.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Thangam. You're quite right. It's been Labour Housing Group. We have had quite a number of questions in, so I'll cut straight to those in view of the time that we've got. The first question that I have here was put in by Nigel Bowness from Lewisham CLP. And Nigel asks, do you envisage a greater role for social housing landlords in mitigating the current and future social and economic impact of the pandemic? What would that look like, and how do you think tenants should be involved?
Well, I envisage it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen, because unfortunately the Tories are in charge and they don't seem to be that keen on social landlords. I would like social landlords to have both capital and revenue support to be able to invest in those properties that are already built, providing they're of high quality. We want to learn from some of the policies that are similar to that from 2008 and the 90s. I'd like housing associations and councils to be able to buy up properties that are already built, if they're good enough quality, and to be able to invest in new homes and refurb, but only of a high quality and only on condition that those homes are offered at proper, reasonable terms that are truly affordable. I would also like the government to undo a dreadful decision they made last week, I think it was, when they said that they were going to water down Section 106 commitments from housing developers, not strengthen them. I want them to go in the other direction. I want them to beef them up. And I think this gives us, unfortunately, in a fuller answer to the question, a worrying indicator of where this government is going. I think watering down Section 106 indicates that they are going to pay less attention to social landlords, not more. Tenants, of course, should be involved, but so too should people who are currently stuck in the private rental sector and are trying to get into the social rented sector. So that means, of course, involving renters' unions, homelessness charities, and other tenants' organisations. And it's difficult sometimes, I think, to get a real representation of tenants, because those who join renters' unions, as we know, are brilliant campaigners, but may not be able to have the resources, may not be funded to or supported to represent the full range of needs. So I'd want to involve as many different tenants in as many different ways as possible. But I think we as Labour campaigners have the duty to, as soon as we can, get back out there, and in our door knocking, we should be prioritising those areas of high housing needs so we can also do that and give those tenants a voice.
Julian Jones put in a question in advance, Thangam, asking how can we get energy efficiency for new homes and a retrofit programme for older houses taken seriously starting now? How might we best approach the development of truly sustainable homes, because it's the key to reduce energy wastage post-COVID for the sake of both our economy and our environment?
Well, hello, Julian. It's nice to see you. And you've put your finger on two critical problems. Well, one political problem, which is how you convince a government that is completely ideologically opposed to our way of doing things to do things the way we would like them to do them. And what amount of energy do you invest in trying to get the government to change its mind now, compared to the amount of energy you put into developing policies for when we're in government? And that's a problem across all policy areas. So I think the way that you try and get it taken seriously now is by reminding this government that though they were dragged kicking and screaming a year ago towards setting a carbon emissions reductions target, they did do it in the end. They were dragged kicking and screaming by us and by campaigners across the country. So I think we remind them that there are various things that have to happen if they are going to meet those targets. And it starts with people's homes. And it starts also, I think, with investing tenants and owner occupiers with a sense of purpose about having truly sustainable homes that are powered by renewable energy, that are well insulated, and that when they have building works done, are done in a way which mitigates against, not contributes to, carbon emissions. Because I agree with you, it's entirely in the interests of both the economy and our carbon emissions reductions targets. Now, I've got a lot of work to do with my colleague, Alan Whitehead, who leads on energy for the front bench. I lead on housing, he leads on energy. So we're doing a piece of work, bringing in other colleagues in the Treasury team and the Bays team to try and work out our plan for what we want to do. But I completely get that you're impatient for it to be taken seriously now. So I think that's a twin job of campaigners outside Parliament and us at the front bench, making that case to government about their need to meet their own targets.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try and go back to Amanda now.
Lovely, I'm unmuted. So good evening, everyone. We'll try again. So Thangam, Labour's 5-point plan, which includes granting renters at least 2 years to pay back any rent arrears accrued due to COVID-19 pandemic, has caused a lot of discussion amongst Labour members. I can understand why members feel cancelling arrears would be the preferred option, but could you explain Labour's rationale for adopting a payback arrangement instead?
Okay. I mean, first of all, we need to go back in time a little bit, because actually the bits of the plan which are about dealing with rent arrears, they go back to the previous leadership under Jeremy Corbyn. This was announced in March by my predecessor, John Healey, and was signed off by Jeremy. So it was 2 pieces of legislation that John Healey, brilliant predecessor, worked on, as I said, to draft a way of making sure that there was legal provision to prevent evictions and to allow for any arrears that accrued not to lead to eviction, but to be able to have a repayment period. And actually, the thing that I did did was I made it more generous, because under Jeremy, that policy in fact was up to 2 years, depending on the length of the remaining tenancy. Now, what we've added on, the new Shadow Cabinet team, is we've added on a prevention aspect, that is putting more money into people's pockets by the 5 improvements to universal credit, by trying to fill the gaps in the job retention scheme and the self-employed income support scheme, by calling for those in the first place, because what we think is important is to try and prevent those arrears happening in the first place. Now, of course, we wouldn't have a broken housing market if we could help it, but we have to face the fact that we're in one. And whether we like it or not, there are contracts with landlords. So if we went, rather than for prevention of arrears, if we went instead for a cancellation of rent, somebody would have to fund the compensation for those cancellation of contracts. So then you have to ask yourself a series of questions. Why do that rather than help people pay up front and not get into arrears? Why not make sure that we have a provision in law to prevent arrears from leading to evictions? So that's what we went for. And as I said, my predecessors did that under Jeremy, and we've just added to it. I think that the difficulty now is that the government has chosen to paint Labour's policy as a rent cancellation policy, which they have then been able to characterise as a policy of us encouraging people to break the law. And that's really unfortunate, because it's given them the political space to be able to walk away from what I think quite a lot of Tory MPs were supportive of, which was dealing with the problems with universal credit and the other 2 income schemes, and dealing with the evictions ban being lifted without any other provisions.
I'm going to go back to Amanda. I think it's got a follow-up question as well.
I can't hear you.
I'm struggling to mute and unmute myself there. Right, lovely. So the next question, Thangam, is according to the Citizens Advice Bureau, an estimated 2.6 million renters are behind or expected to fall behind with their rent. And we know the moratorium on court possession hearings are due to end on the 29th of June, enabling landlords to evict tenants because of arrears. Therefore, we are due to see a huge surge in people losing their homes amid the coronavirus crisis. Do you think that welfare benefit reforms such as suspending the benefit cap, the bedroom tax, and improving on the local housing allowance to address the shortfall in rent could go somewhere to protecting renters?
Yes, and every single part of that is in the Labour policy in the 5-point plan, and all of which we've announced and re-announced several times in the last few weeks. So yes, I agree, but unfortunately the government's chosen to ignore that.
Succinct and to the point there. Can I go to Ross Houston for the next question, please?
Thank you, Thangam, for joining us. I'm a councillor in London, in Barnet, and I was really outraged when I saw the backtracking from the government on the continued additional funding to keep rough sleepers off the streets, which was announced as part of the COVID-19 package. I have real concerns about people being put back onto the streets, particularly with those without recourse to public funds, and those who are not in the category of priority need, and have no council duty to be rehoused. I think there's a real problem, and we have managed to get rid of all our rough sleepers, far more than the council districts showed that we had, and we've housed them all. Some of them are EU nationals, for example. A couple of cases I'm aware of, who didn't apply for citizenship. They weren't in a place to be able to do that. And there is a real issue with that particular category of rough sleeper who doesn't have recourse to public funds. Do you agree it'd be untenable and completely unacceptable to throw rough sleepers back onto the street?
Yes, of course. I mean, of course. I mean, that's why last week I did a whole chunk of work for the announcement that Keir made with various Labour metro mayors and council leaders challenging the government on exactly this. You can also see that from my record of written parliamentary questions and challenges I made to the one opportunity I've been given so far to address the Secretary of State publicly in virtual parliament. You can see that I raised it there. That also no recourse to public funds. I don't know how many of you were watching the awful liaison committee just now with Boris Johnson, that he wandered into a trap that Stephen Timms laid for him to commit to going back and looking at the problem of people with no recourse for public funds. I don't think he knew what he was agreeing to, actually. We've called for all of this. So, of course, it's untenable. And I can only say, yet again, this is, unfortunately, the government's taken notice of us on some things and less on others. And on the initiative about that they announced 2 days ago, that Louise Casey announced on the what should happen after the end of the Rough Sleepers initiative, as far as I can see, consulting with local government colleagues over the last few days, all they've done is shuffle forward some pre-existing money that was already announced. And I'm very fearful, because I know the state that local government finance is in, I'm extremely fearful that all that's done is fail to take account of the actual cost that you in local government have had to spend already, because I know there's a funding gap between what was promised and what's actually been delivered, and compound that by saying, great, we're now going to solve the problem of rough sleeping, without actually giving you the tools to do that. Because I know you guys actually do know how to do that. And I know that talk about putting in the support services is all well and good, but only if the money's there to pay for the necessary debt counselling and mental health counselling and drug and alcohol counselling and wraparound support that the government's fond of referring to, but doesn't seem to have costed terribly well. So I'm in the process of gathering experiences, views and facts and figures from local councils. And if you'd like to send me anything to use in my communication with Louise Casey and the Secretary of State, which I'll be writing to them sometime early next week, I'll be really grateful, Ross. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Moving into a sort of a broader look at where we're heading now. I mean, clearly it looks like we're moving into a major recession. One of the questions that's been put by our members is, what do you see as the most important aspect of housing policy in dealing with the effects of that recession?
Well, here again, we come to that challenge of the fact that we unfortunately look like we might have 4 more years of Tory management of that recession. I think any decent social democrat would be at least looking at and trying to work out a cost-benefit analysis for counter-cyclical investment in the purchasing, retrofitting and building of new housing, and particularly in the social housing sector, and particularly again in the council housing sector. I think any decent government should at least be working out how that could be part of a recovery plan, because it also helps increase employment. It might also be a way to redeploy people who've lost their jobs in other industries that are really going to struggle. So that should be, in my view, one of the most important aspects of housing policy in dealing with the effects, because those are both economic effects and the lessons we've learned about housing and the impact of having poor quality, high cost housing in the private rented sector in particular. So I'm working on this, as I think I mentioned, cross-departmentally with Labour's front benchers in the BEIS, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and the Treasury teams, so that we can try and work out what we would be doing and what we will do when we hopefully win the next general election. And in the meantime, I'll be putting that to government and saying, you are government, you've got civil servants, you should be costing this up, you should be working out what to do in the detail, but this is my view, that you should be investing in housing.
That segues nicely actually to the next question that was being posed by members here. Looking forward to that next Labour government that we're all hoping and praying for, what do you think will be the biggest challenges facing that government in terms of developing sufficient and appropriate housing for the whole community?
Well, probably the economic and social consequences of 14 years of Tory government. I mean, that goes across all policy areas. It goes across all departments. And it's one of the reasons why I am being extremely careful, as are all members of the Shadow Cabinet. I mean, extremely careful about what we announce that could cost money, because we're 4 years out and we don't know what an awful mess the Tories are going to make of recovery. We can hypothesize that it won't be great, but it's extremely important that we're quite ambitious in our vision, but cautious in our spending commitments this early on, because of the awful mess of 14 years of austerity, which is what I expect we're going back to, no matter what the government says. I think that's where we're heading back to.
Which is a frightening thought, I'm sure.
I'm afraid
we'll
it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a frightening thought, but also too is the fact that even if the Tories don't change the boundaries, and they're gonna, we need to win 123 seats in order to form a majority of 1. So we've got to do both at the same time. I think someone mentioned on the chat about campaigning on housing. Housing is one of our best areas. It's where we can do really well as a Labour Party. We've got to be out there campaigning as soon as possible and making that campaign really deep into those parts of the country. And I'm afraid to say they are across the entire United Kingdom where we have been losing for 4 successive general elections.
Okay, and that actually picks up, as you say, on a question that Dermot had posed in the chat. He mentions that the connections between policy and campaigning you just referred to there.
Yeah.
He's in the process of writing to all his private tenants in HMOs that are registered with Bromley Council. Have we got any examples of campaigning in the private rented sector that could be shared?
Gosh, I mean, I think there's a lot. But we're now campaigning in a new way. And the reason I'm not going to give you a quick answer is because I think it's quite difficult to encapsulate where we are in the middle of the COVID crisis, because we can't do the sort of campaigning that we're used to. We're having to do campaigning in a different way. And we don't know yet what we're going to be dealt as we go into the next stage. Now, I think our next campaigning has got to be big public messaged campaigns against the evictions crisis that I think we're heading towards. And I think that is best done by CLPs working locally with homelessness organisations, with renters unions where possible, where they exist, with other tenants organisations and with Labour councillors. And I think that's got to be a big piece of campaigning work that we're going to have to do imminently. The difficulty I think we've got at the moment is how we campaign in this new digital world, which doesn't give us door knocking, doesn't give us constituency surgeries, doesn't give us public meetings, but we're going to have to work around that pretty quick. So good examples. I think I'm gradually gathering up a picture of what different Labour councils are doing. And I think there are good examples of Labour councils doing good things about how they're making use of their existing landlord regulation schemes and their existing provision. As for the campaigning, I don't have a good answer for you yet at the moment, because campaigning seems so tricky to do while we're still in the lockdown. I'd be grateful for any ideas, by the way.
Okay. Get your thinking caps on, folks, and certainly share that in the chat and subsequently. Clearly, this is a big issue that we're going to have to address. I'm going to go for the next question to Nikki Gavron. Hang on, Nikki, I think we just got to unmute you first.
Yeah.
Oh. Are we able to unmute Nikki?
Sorry, it's refusing to let me unmute Nikki. I'll try once more.
I think, unfortunately, I think the way it's set, you have to unmute Sheila, but then she has to accept it, which I know is going to be tricky. Because when you unmuted me, I had to click on it.
Oh.
I think it's the way the webinar thing is set up.
Do you remember the days when we didn't know what unmuting was? Shall I ask? I'll ask the question that Nikki was going to put. Then, if we're struggling to get that, get the technology to work.
Sorry,
there.
Nikki.
So what Nikki was going to ask was, how can we promote the use of modular off-site factory-built housing? Done to scale, it has many advantages, including the speed of delivery, and of course, it's easier to socially distance on site.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think there's a lot of people who have residual memories of off-site modular housing that they didn't like. And I can remember when there was talk of using containers in a housing development that I know quite well in Amsterdam. And when I talked about it, I've actually been to see it. And when I talked about it to some colleagues over here, they were just horrified. And actually what I saw was a way of putting up high quality, really affordable housing really, really quickly in a neighbourhood that was being redeveloped after being used as left as an industrial wasteland for a long time. So I think how we can promote it is through the fact that it's speedy and it can be of extremely high quality. But we're going to have to dismantle some people's residual memory and myth of badly done off-site modular housing. I think that's part of the challenge here. But I think we can do that because there's some really, really good examples from across this country, but also across other parts of Northern Europe in particular. And you're absolutely right, it's got loads of advantages.
I know that Nikki also wanted to ask a follow-on, partly a follow-on question to that, which was the fact that we need to look again at space standards, given that we now know how everyone needs some outside space, proper ventilation and daylight. Sure, we can all empathise with that at the moment. How do we get that on the table as quite an urgent issue?
Well, I think that's all part of this big call that we need to make as one in the Labour movement on the government, which is that why would the government want to come out of the lockdown and not want to learn the lessons for housing? Why would they not want to make sure that we never again have to urgently rehouse rough sleepers, urgently deal with a finance scheme to support people in the private rented sector? But in this particular question, why would we not want why would the government not want to make sure people have decent space, ventilation and daylight? I've been really haunted in this lockdown by a picture in my head of two of my tower blocks in my patch. I've got 36 tower blocks, and there's two next door to each other, one which has everybody has access to outdoor space, and then one next door where nobody does. And I know anecdotally from my own caseload who's really struggling as a result. So Mike Amesbury, who is my shadow housing minister, we're a much smaller team than John Healy's, there's only two of us. But Mike's got planning on his portfolio, and I think he will want to be in touch with you about how we make that part of the campaign on planning.
That's great. I'm sure we'll certainly be willing to be part of that conversation.
Good.
I'm going to go back to Amanda now for the next question, touching again back on the private rented sector.
Okay. I've got myself down for the last question.
Yeah, I thought I'd move us into that one now.
Yeah, let's move on to the last question then. Okay, Thangam, since 2012, 2013, this Conservative government have decimated the legal aid scheme, making it harder for renters to access legal advice and assistance in housing cases. Without access to justice, landlords have an unfair advantage because they can afford to appoint lawyers. In light of the increase in eviction cases because of the pandemic, would you concede that it is vital that legal aid is made available for all who need it? So I work as a housing solicitor in the north of the country for a charitable organisation, and we've seen a surge of eviction proceedings anyway, and we know that things are going to get worse after the pandemic. But there is a real issue of people accessing access to justice. So I'd be interested to know also what campaign is happening at the moment by the Labour Party to try and improve on the system that we have already.
So you said, would I concede that it's vital that legal aid is made available? I don't need to concede it. I just agree with it. I'm entirely aware that it matters that legal aid is available. Of course, I support people having access to it. And at the very, very least, people need to have access to the duty solicitors. And that is at real risk at the moment. As courts are being moved from real to virtual, we're hearing already, and I've challenged the government on this already publicly, that courts are telling tenants at risk of eviction proceedings that they will not have access to a duty solicitor, which they should have. And so that is, we start with the very worst of it, which is if the court proceedings for evictions move to online or on telephone and tenants don't have access to the duty solicitor. That's the very worst of all worlds. That's no legal advice at all, no opportunity either to get decent legal advice. So yes, of course, and I'm working with my colleagues in the Justice team on what Labour's plan for renewing the legal aid scheme as a whole will be. And as I said earlier, I can't make announcements at the moment that are about funding commitments. I have to work through them carefully. Unfortunately, we've got 4 years, because it's really important that as we're campaigning as a Labour Party that we know how we can fund what we want to do. And as I said, we've got ahead of us some terrible economic deprivation by this Tory government. But what I can do, and I am doing, and David Lammy and I both commented on this today, was say publicly as a front bench, tenants should have access to legal aid. to legal advice, and that should be free and that should be available. And at the moment, we're facing a government, a Tory government, who wouldn't concede that it's vital.
Nigel Bowness has raised a question in the chat, which I think is quite interesting in terms of what we understand from what other socialist parties, presumably means in Europe and elsewhere, have been doing. Is there anything we can observe from the approach that they've taken around policy towards COVID? Is there any good practice that we can perhaps draw upon in shaping our policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I am aware of, and you've given me a good nudge actually, Nigel, because I think so many of us have just been overwhelmed by trying to focus on what's happening in front of our noses, that it's important that we lift our eyes to what's happening in our sister parties. One thing I do know is that in some of our European sister parties, some of our European counterparts have been able to get better financial support for everybody up front, and that's what I would have liked. That's what I would have preferred, so that you get people's housing needs actually covered by making sure they got decent financial support, and that there aren't these egregious gaps, which there are unfortunately in this government schemes. I mean, it's good that they got the schemes, but there are too many egregious gaps in between them and too many get outs, and there are other governments who have done much better, where socialist and social democrat values have been imbued into the COVID response to make sure that everybody has some form of financial support that can cover their housing needs. Now, as for what happens afterwards, I think you've raised a really good point, Nigel. I've just written that down, that I think with our sister parties across the European Union in particular, it'd be good for all of us, and I include Labour Housing Group and Labour councillors, if we could make some good proactive contacts. Maybe we should arrange one of these with some of our sister parties, or find some way of doing that. So I've just written myself a reminder. So thank you for that suggestion.
Great. I think we also written a reminder from the LHG end on that as well. We're really keen to take part in that.
Yeah.
Again, that leads us again to looking forward, and without wanting to create any issues with the shadow treasury team. Will we need new kinds of public finance to support a house building programme to meet the need as we come back into office?
Well, yes, I would have thought we do, and I would have thought that there's various things we could look at. So different sorts of infrastructure investment banking, I think, is really important. When we think about, we had policies on that for how we invest in environmental work. Now, I think that it's certainly worth us investigating whether or not we need to set up something similar specifically for housing and maybe other infrastructure as well. So yeah, I mean, that's part of what I'm working on with the Bays and the Treasury team, definitely, because I think we're going to have to look at everything. We're going to have to look at all sorts of different ways of leveraging funding from the private sector as well as from government, because like I said, unfortunately, we may well be left with the damaging effects of yet 4 more years of Tory government.
You'll have seen in the chat as well, members also raising questions around private landlord selective licensing schemes. Totally. Ross has mentioned being described as the Hugo Chavez of his part of London there. Yeah. Certainly, the question was going to be the one that Alan Heppel had raised here, but I'm getting the agreement with it already. Do you think that they have merit in improving the quality of private rented sector homes and also local communities?
Well, yeah, of course. I just want them to be stronger, and I want local authorities to have greater powers to make them widespread, you know, unanimous and universal, and also cover short-term lets and the evasion by some landlords of their duties to have decent quality accommodation by just ducking out of the private rented sector and going for the Airbnb market instead, in poor quality housing that doesn't have to meet the same standards of regulation. So I think there's lots of loopholes we need to be closing, and having a decent private rented sector licensing scheme is a critical tool. I think the fact that we've got the beginnings of one is great, and I urge all local councillors to do what I know so many Labour and Tory councils are doing, as has been referred to by Barnett. But I know there are gaps in the regulatory framework that allows you to do what I think you would want to do, and that's definitely on my list, because it can absolutely make a real difference. Because it's got to be it's got to be on quality, but it's also got to be on price, it's got to be on tenure, and actually legislating for a PRS licensing scheme that can use all 3 criteria, and then say, and this is not worked through, these are things that are on my list at the moment. What would it look like if we had a PRS licensing scheme that meant that if you were a landlord that didn't pass those standards, you could not be in receipt of public money? what would that look like? I think that's really important. I think it's important that we look at that for private rents, but also for homeless accommodation, for particular subgroups such as asylum seeker accommodation, in which I believe, I've been in some, that I think is just not fit for human habitation, but is nevertheless costing the public purse a lot of money and treating people very, very badly. So I'd like that across the whole of our rental sector, is to make sure that there are standards and a means of checking them and enforcing them that give everybody high quality housing. I meant what I said. Everybody should have decent housing of high quality, of a tenure that they can cope with at a price that's genuinely affordable. That goes to whether you're in the private or the social rented sector.
That also leads us, I think, into another question that was raised by members in advance of today's event. Namely, would a wide-ranging drop in house prices be a danger or an opportunity for the Labour Party?
Yeah, I've thought about this one a lot, because I don't think it's generally helpful for me to call anything caused by the coronavirus and the Conservatives' appalling handling of it an opportunity. And I'm not sure I feel even comfortable calling it a political anything. I think the whole thing is just an absolute tragedy, and too many people have suffered too much to look at it in that way, certainly yet. But when I said about the walking through the sort of doorway of coronavirus, it's going to have a range of consequences. One of them might be a change in house prices, but to be honest, that's a symptom, not the overriding problem of a broken housing market. There is a broken housing system that predates COVID. And whether or not the house rises drop or fall, there will be winners and losers either way. And that includes people in very vulnerable positions who might lose if they went down, or who might lose if they go up. So I think either way, there's a problem. But it's tackling the underlying causes, which are a broken housing system. That's where my focus is. And we'll have to factor in, any change in house prices. But like I said, very unfortunately, there's a Tory government in charge of that at the moment. So we're going to have to work out how that affects any housing policy that we come up with.
Members who are taking part in this session this evening, there's been a number of questions that have been raised here around leaseholders and what Labour's approach should be and our offer should be to leaseholders. There's several issues that have been picked up here. Rather than synthesise them, I'm just going to sort of open up as a question to you, Thangam, around what are your thoughts around what our approach should be with regard to leaseholders going forward?
Well, I think as Dermot's recognised there in the chat, leaseholders live in all sorts of seats, not just those that are held currently by Labour MPs, but some that are held by Tory MPs who won them off Labour MPs. I think that I disagree with you, Dermot, slightly. My experience is that there's been a whole load of Labour MPs talking about the housing problems of leaseholders. It's come up time and again. I'm thinking of people like Justin Madders, who put down a private members bill on this in particular, but also my predecessor, John Healey, and his team. Leaseholders and leasehold reform is on my colleague Mike Amesbury's list, and he's working really hard on it, and he's consulting with leaseholder groups. I think the most egregious treatment of leaseholders at the moment is the fact that they're being made financially liable for cladding that they have no say in, that is causing them risk and that they are paying for. I think that's a particularly egregious example of how badly leaseholders are treated. I think if we also start right now with, if we were designing a system from scratch, we wouldn't design one with leasehold in it, would we? So we have to think of, if we're going to work backwards, what does a truly affordable, ethical housing system look like? It probably doesn't look like one that's got leasehold built into it. How you undo that, it's a bit like how you undo the private rented sector. You're all housing campaigners, you know that it's never completely straightforward, but the commitment politically is that leaseholders in particular, with the fire safety bills, with the waking watch that's going on at the moment, are one of the biggest priorities. And the problems getting insurance, Mike, I know, is in discussion and quite serious challenge with insurance companies about that. It's something that we're going to be working on really, really hard. And particularly, we're coming up to the anniversary of the Grenfell fire, and I think that's going to fall on the next housing and local government questions in Parliament, and so we will be raising this.
Sheila has asked whether we should look at having an accreditation scheme that landlords should comply with, as well as training that they must complete. She points out this is what happens in Germany.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no end of good arguments for that, aren't there? You could tie it into the private rented registration scheme, that you couldn't get registered unless you either had fulfilled all those criteria yourself, or you were letting via an agent who had, or both, one or the other. You know, I think it's one of the few forms of earning an income that is really poorly regulated. Like, you can't set up as a doctor without having a qualification to be a doctor, but you can set up as a landlord without a qualification or a recognition that there are certain qualities and pieces of knowledge that you might have to have. I think there are good landlords. I think there are landlords who take their responsibilities extremely seriously. And I think there are landlords who take advantage of the loophole in the fact that they're not required to fulfill any professional regulations. And I think that that is something we should have. We should certainly be looking at what that would look like as part of a much, much stronger regulatory system for the private rented sector as a whole. I mean, it's really unbalanced, isn't it, the housing market? We know that over the last 10 years, successive Tory governments have brought in policies that have tilted the housing market away from truly affordable and social housing and toward the unaffordable private rented. We know that. Now, if you're going to do that, you could decide that that's what you're going to do and then regulate for it properly. But they haven't done that. They've allowed it to happen and they failed to regulate it properly. So they've got these twin problems of prices going up but quality going down. And both of those, ironically, leading to it being harder and harder for people who want to buy their own homes or own their own homes to be able to afford to do that. It's completely skewed the housing market. Now, you'd have thought that a Tory government would care about whether or not people could afford to buy their own homes, instead of which they've come up with a scheme here, a scheme there. And I'm not knocking them, because they help a lot of people to own a home, who wanted to own a home, who actually saw it as a way out of the appalling treatment they might have been getting in another part of the sector. But I think it's curious that the Tories have chosen to ignore the consequences of an over-dependency and an ever-increasing use of the private rented sector, especially as it's so unregulated.
Just picking up on another question, again from Sheila in the chat, looking forward to the National Policy Forum. Yeah. What are the priorities you'll be looking for that to address as we move into shaping Labour's policy offer?
Well, all of the above. I mean, I just think, seriously, I don't know. I'm not going to repeat all of the above, but the National Policy Forum, it predates me. You know, it's been meeting for some time. That particular policy, Housing and Transport Policy Commission bit of it has been meeting, and the National Policy Forum has reinvigorated and renewed. I really, really hope that Labour Housing Group will have a really strong voice in that, please, because you've got all this ideas and expertise, and you know all these things. Everything you're putting in the chat room, I think we should be considering in the National Policy Forum.
Sounds like an open invite to all of our LHG members.
We are a member-led party and a democratic party, so I'm not actually in charge of who goes on MPF. We all get to vote on that. I get the same number of votes as you do as a member.
Well, I'm sure we'll certainly seize that opportunity.
Good. Do.
We're doing exceptionally well for a Labour Party event, in that we seem to be running to time. Excellent. So I'm just checking if there's any further questions that anybody would like to pick up on at this point. Ross, do you want to come in with your question there? Hang on, we just need to unmute you, I think.
I'm interested in your thoughts about how we make housing associations that have been coming to some criticism more accountable to residents and to their communities. Some of them have become very large, some of them become very actually unresponsive to the concerns of local communities. They are ultimately publicly funded. Let's not pretend that most of their stock wasn't funded out of a housing grant originally. How do we actually empower residents to have a say in how their associations are run, and the wider community?
I mean, I've got ideas, and I bet you have too. And definitely what I don't want to do, I don't want to set up a relationship between us that goes on for the next 4 years, where you ask me questions and you try to nudge me towards what you want to be the answers. I think it would be better if we actually had, next time we meet, more of an open discussion, because I think you already know, Ross, I think, we need tenant representation on housing association boards. We need recruitment policies for housing associations so that the jobs that those housing associations offer give people a chance, that their actual tenants have a chance to work in those housing associations. We need much more public scrutiny of how, and transparency, and I think good housing associations do those things. But I think we really need to make sure that we've started this relationship between us and that we develop and expand it, where I'm doing more listening and you're doing more talking. Because I think that we will be able to produce much more constructive and well-rounded housing policy if we spend the next 4 years working together collaboratively on this. Because so many of you all around the country, you've got a vast experience that I can't possibly hope to emulate, because you have a deep experience in particular parts of the country, in particular aspects of housing policy, that I want to make sure we're building into Labour policy. So thank you. I've written your name down, Ross. I'm going to come back to you for that.
That's really helpful there. And also you'll see in the chat that there's a lot of support around this point of further regulation around registered providers. Yep. So clearly something for some further discussion there. There's just one other question which, my apologies, I didn't pick up on earlier on, and that was from Charles Townley, who refers to in Stroud District, they've been looking at how they can use discretionary housing payments and expand those to be much more sympathetic to tenants in debt than the statutory national schemes are. Are there any examples which have been developed which are suitable to the exceptional circumstances that we're in with COVID? And also, is there any lobbying that we can do to government around increasing that allocation?
I mean, yeah, I know that there are some local authorities who are using their DHPs in that way already, but I think it's pretty tight on you all, because Labour councillors are having to cope with really stretched budgets. They were stretched thin in the first place because the funding cuts have disproportionately fallen on Labour councils over the last 10 years. And it's got worse because not only have you lost income as councils have lost income through the COVID crisis for understandable reasons because of the lockdown, but also had greater spending burdens placed on them without an adequate recompense. So yeah, I want discretionary housing payments to be better used, but I think that we need to make sure that the housing system is providing, and the finance and benefit system and wages are good enough so that discretionary housing payments can go back to being discretionary and exceptional need, rather than where we are at the moment, which is the demands on Labour councils at the moment are that they should use DHP to top up what should have been topped up by the government. If the government had just heeded the call to look again at local housing allowance, then we wouldn't need councils to be having to top up private rents just to get people through maybe what might just be a 2 or 3 months more before people are back in work. I mean, with any luck and a decent government, okay, that's tricky, but let's say with some luck, an awful lot of people who are currently not able to pay rent will be back in work in a few months' time. That's the hope, isn't it? And it just seems to me to be appalling that local councils are having to scratch around and try and find ways of using their DHP. But yes, there are good examples of Labour councils that are doing that, but I don't envy them having to try and balance their budgets.
Well, having come from a discussion in Birmingham on just that subject today, I think it's
painful,
certainly powerfully resonates. Absolutely.
It's painful. And it's wrong, and it's so unjust, and it makes me so angry when I think how hard Labour councillors across the country have worked in this crisis. You've worked, so hard to accommodate people, and it was all very well. The government said everybody in, do what you need, and we'll cover the costs. And you worked so hard to make that happen. And you've been let down, in my view, by a government that said, oh, well, maybe it shouldn't have cost quite that much. Oh, well, we're not going to cover people who got no recourse to public funds. Oh, we won't cover people who are newly street homeless. They've made so many caveats to it that you guys, because you're generous and hardworking and committed and you value social justice, you've accommodated people for which the government is refusing to pick up the tab. And they feel like they can get away with the glory by saying everybody in and we're going to end rough sleeping. And actually, they just dumped it on you. I think I'm feeling particularly angry today because some of you who are local councillors will probably have had a similar experience to me over the weekend, which is people who are really struggling right now as a result of this government's coronavirus rules, which we all bought into. And we all said to the government, we want you to succeed. We want this to work because people's lives are at stake. People feeling really exceptionally betrayed by the way that the Prime Minister has behaved towards the indefensible defence of his special advisor. And I think I have, I've never lost it, but today I felt a really visceral feeling of anger. And just before we were doing this, we started this, I was watching him on the liaison committee, and just, I don't often feel like losing my temper, but I really did feel, and in fact, I ended up not wanting to lose my temper. It just made me want to cry, because I just thought so many people, councillors have worked so hard, housing charities and homeless campaigners, and people have put themselves last and the greater good first. People have behaved like socialists across the country by repressing their instincts and putting the wider society's needs first. And I feel really, on behalf of the people that I represent and people across the country who are in difficulties with their rent because they've put the country's greater good before their own needs, I feel really angry and really let down. I think that's why I'm feeling slightly bleak this evening and not able to say, look, I think the government's going to agree with us. I'm afraid to say I feel like they've probably agreed with us as far as they're going to, and from now on in, it's going to be really tough. So I just wanted to share that, because I felt like probably everyone's feeling a bit of that today.
I think everybody can certainly empathise with that. The only thing I can think by way of a positive note is, after we get angry, we get organised. And
Yes,
I think this evening is absolutely the start of that process. Thangam, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. This is obviously the start of our relationship between yourself as the front bench lead and as Labour Housing Group. We're really looking forward to working with you on these important issues.
Can I just add to that, John, that I'm hoping that we're going to find a way to have virtual Labour Party housing conference. I mean, I know you've got your own conference, which I'm hoping I'm going to be able to be at, but I think now we know we're not having actual Labour conference, we should try and work out a way of doing something virtual.
Absolutely. And I was also just going to flag up that we're also planning a virtual LHG conference as well. So yeah, and watch our website for that, which is labourhousing.org. I think it's been a really interesting set of discussions. Thank you, Thangam, for coming and joining us. Looking forward to working with you. And can I thank everybody who's put questions in and participated this evening. We've got a lot of work to do, but let's get out there.